I have to say, for most people, life during the 1,000 years we call the Middle Ages was actually pretty decent. But medieval Europe was anything but consistent. Life could swing wildly from one extreme to the other depending on the century you lived in, the region you called home, and whether you were born into nobility, owned land, or worked the fields as a laborer. There were stretches of time when people enjoyed good harvests, had enough food to fill their stomachs, and even caught a small glimpse of improving living standards and new opportunities. Then there were the darker years, when one disaster followed another. Hunger, disease, and constant warfare combined to make everyday life incredibly difficult. If we're talking about the more bearable periods of the Middle Ages, the 14th century definitely wasn't one of them. Before I jump into today's story, though, I want to show you something that I think many of you would honestly enjoy. If you've ever looked at one of those medieval maps and laughed because it showed sea monsters swallowing ships while somehow claiming to represent the world accurately, then you'll probably appreciate this. It's called the Great Explorers Maps Collection from 55 Maps. This collection features beautifully designed maps that trace some of the most famous voyages from the Age of Discovery, when explorers sailed into the unknown trying to answer questions about what lay beyond the horizon. Every now and then, they even managed to stumble across entire continents completely by accident. You can follow the expeditions of famous explorers like Columbus, Magellan, and Vespucci, seeing the routes they traveled, the important places where they stopped, and why each journey mattered in history. The collection also includes carefully restored historical maps that reveal how people viewed the world centuries ago, and just how spectacularly wrong many of those ideas turned out to be. As someone who spends a lot of time digging into history, I really enjoy seeing these old maps brought back to life with this much care and detail. They're available in vintage, modern, and even 3D styles, either as digital downloads or professionally printed wall art. If you'd like to check them out yourself, there's currently a 20% Kickstarter discount available through the link in the description below. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into today's story. Welcome to Medieval Madness. The good old days. Believe it or not, the years before the 14th century had actually been pretty good by medieval standards. Throughout much of Western and Central Europe, populations were growing, farming was improving, and political conflicts had settled into something close to a stalemate. After all the turmoil that marked the early Middle Ages, this almost felt like real stability, or at least as stable as medieval life ever became. Out in the countryside, farmers benefited from better tools, heavier plows, and the wider use of the three-field farming system. Those improvements led to larger harvests and more reliable food supplies. Hunger certainly hadn't disappeared, but outright starvation changed from being an everyday threat into something people faced much less often. Meanwhile, towns continued to grow, trade expanded, and merchants and skilled craftsmen found themselves living through a fairly prosperous period. Their talents could finally earn them a respectable living. Warfare hadn't vanished either, but it was usually smaller in scale, stayed close to home, and often followed a seasonal pattern. A peasant might lose a year's harvest during a raid, but entire regions generally escaped the widespread devastation that would become common in later centuries. Disease was always present in the background, quietly waiting for an opportunity, but the catastrophic pandemics that would later devastate Europe had not yet arrived. There was also a growing sense of cultural confidence. Massive cathedrals stretched higher into the sky. Legal systems became more organized, and some of Europe's earliest universities began opening their doors. Life expectancy remained painfully short, but anyone lucky enough to survive childhood could at least enjoy the comforting belief that tomorrow would probably look a lot like today. During the Middle Ages, that kind of predictability was a rare luxury. Hard rain falling. Everything seemed to change the moment the 14th century arrived. It was almost as if the air itself suddenly turned colder. Hard rain falling. The freezing weather was only the first sign of the misery that was about to unfold. The Baltic Sea froze completely solid, not just once, but twice, first in 1303 and then again during the winter of 1306 and 1307. After that, Europe was hit by one stretch of terrible weather after another. Violent storms arrived out of season, temperatures dropped unexpectedly, relentless rain soaked the countryside, and even the waters of the Caspian Sea began to rise. Of course, nobody living through those years had any idea they were witnessing the beginning of what we now call the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long period of unstable weather caused by expanding polar and mountain glaciers. People at the time also couldn't see the larger changes happening beyond their borders. Contact with Greenland was slowly breaking down, and the Norse settlements there were quietly disappearing. Iceland lost its grain harvests, while much of Scandinavia watched its own crops gradually fail. Even without modern science, though, people knew something was terribly wrong. They could feel the bitter cold settling into their bones. They watched the sun disappear earlier from the fields, and farmers noticed the one thing that mattered more than anything else. The growing season was becoming shorter every year. During the Middle Ages, that wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a warning that famine was closing in. The worsening climate couldn't have come at a worse time. Europe's population had already pushed medieval farming to its absolute limit. By the year 1300, nearly every piece of land that could reasonably be farmed had already been cleared and put to use. With the farming methods available at the time, there simply wasn't any more productivity left to squeeze from the soil. Without proper fertilizers or effective crop rotation, the land gradually lost its ability to produce healthy harvests. Trade wasn't much help either. Medieval commerce connected many places, but it wasn't capable of transporting huge amounts of grain over long distances. Only communities with access to rivers or the sea could move food in large quantities. Inland towns and villages depended almost entirely on whatever nearby farms could grow. When those harvests failed, people didn't just struggle, they starved. The population boom of the previous century had already outgrown the available food supply, leaving many people underfed and dangerously weak before the crisis even began. As conditions worsened, hunger gave way to absolute horror. Stories spread of desperate parents resorting to cannibalism and eating their own children. In Poland, reports claimed that starving people cut down the bodies of executed criminals from the gallows just to find something to eat. As if famine alone weren't enough, dysentery swept through communities whose bodies had already been weakened by starvation. The disease only added another layer of suffering, while smaller local famines continued to erupt again and again across different parts of Europe. Impending doom. The opening decades of the 14th century brought one disaster after another. 4 major events unfolded in rapid succession, each making it painfully clear that the century had no intention of becoming any kinder. The first involved a bitter conflict between Pope Boniface VIII and King Philip IV of France, better known as Philip the Fair. Their dispute centered on whether the clergy should pay taxes to the French crown. As tensions escalated, Philip accused the Pope of shocking crimes, including sorcery and sodomy. Boniface answered by excommunicating the king, but Philip refused to back down. The confrontation reached its climax in 1303 when agents loyal to Philip captured the 86-year-old pope. Boniface was eventually released, but the humiliation and stress proved too much for him, and he died shortly afterward. In time, the French-backed Pope, Clement V, took his place. The next major shift came when the papacy itself was relocated to Avignon in France, placing the church under much stronger French influence. Then came the dramatic destruction of the Knights Templar. Once again, Philip IV was at the center of the story. After years of expensive wars and extravagant spending, the French king had buried himself in debt, much of it owed to the Templars. Rather than repay what he owed, he chose a different solution. By fueling public fear and inventing accusations, he created a political campaign designed to eliminate the powerful military order altogether. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, Philip ordered the mass arrest of the Knights Templar throughout France. It marked the beginning of a coordinated effort to dismantle one of the most influential organizations of the medieval world. The Templars were accused of crimes such as heresy, blasphemy, and homosexual practices. Many were tortured into confessing, numerous members were burned at the stake, and eventually the entire order was officially dissolved. The fourth major blow arrived in 1320 with the outbreak of the Pastoureaux, better known as the Shepherds' Crusade. What began in northern France as a movement of shepherds, peasants, and religious zealots soon grew into another violent upheaval that added even more instability to an already troubled century. But what started as a movement aimed at fighting the Muslims in Spain quickly took a far darker turn. Instead, it became a wave of violence that led to the massacre of hundreds of Jews and people suffering from leprosy. Looking back, all of these events together felt like an ominous warning, an apocalyptic opening act that foreshadowed the even greater disasters the century still had in store. By 1315, people across medieval Europe were already experiencing devastation on an unimaginable scale. The Great Hunger. The Great Famine truly began in the spring of 1315, when the rains arrived and simply refused to stop. Day after day, the downpours continued with such relentless intensity that medieval chroniclers compared them to the flood described in the Bible. By this point, Europe's population had grown so large that the land could only support everyone when harvests were consistently good. Once those harvests began to fail across the continent, the balance collapsed almost overnight, pushing entire regions from barely surviving into outright starvation. The crop failures continued through 1316 and didn't begin to ease until the harvest of 1317. Even then, recovery was painfully slow, and it wasn't until around 1322 that conditions finally started returning to something close to normal. By then, an entire generation had learned to fear dark clouds gathering in the sky. The disaster reached far beyond empty grain stores. Starving and weakened cattle became easy victims of disease, triggering the Great Bovine Pestilence. The epidemic wiped out as much as 80% of Europe's cattle and sheep, creating a livestock catastrophe that left fields without animals to pull the plows and villages without milk to drink. The years that followed were filled with suffering. Crime increased, disease spread more easily, and death became an ordinary part of daily life. Medieval chronicles even recorded horrifying accounts of cannibalism and parents killing their own children, grim reminders of just how far an entire continent had been pushed beyond its limits. The longest time. As Europe struggled through famine, another disaster was beginning to unfold. What started as a feudal dispute over the Duchy of Aquitaine eventually exploded into the long conflict between England and France that we now know as the 100 Years' War. The fighting officially began in 1337 and stretched across the rest of the 14th century before finally ending in the middle of the 15th. Over time, what had started as a disagreement over territory grew into a massive military, political, and economic struggle that pulled in allies from across Western Europe. It was also fueled by the early rise of national identity on both sides. Historians call it the 100 Years' War, even though it actually lasted 116 years. The name can make it sound like the fighting never stopped, but that wasn't really the case. Battles came in waves, interrupted by long truces, financial collapse, royal succession crises, and occasionally by simple exhaustion and common sense. The arrival of the Black Death forced armies to put aside their weapons while they struggled just to survive. At other times, wars paused because kings ran out of money, soldiers, heirs, or even healthy people to continue fighting. The conflict repeatedly flared up, died down, and then erupted all over again. Across those generations, 5 successive kings from 2 rival royal dynasties fought over the French throne. France was the richest and most heavily populated kingdom in Western Europe, making it a prize that many believed was worth any amount of bloodshed. the war permanently changed European history. During its early years, the ideals of chivalry reached their greatest heights, only to slowly collapse beneath the brutal reality of endless warfare. Both kingdoms drew a colorful collection of allies into their dynastic struggle. England claimed many of the early victories, helped by the devastating effectiveness of the longbow and repeated mistakes made by the French. In the end, however, the House of Valois managed to restore control over France. England was left with little to show for more than a century of fighting except enormous debt, lasting trauma, and countless dead soldiers. The Great Mortality. After the Great Famine finally loosened its grip, Europe slowly began putting itself back together. The recovery wasn't easy, but little by little the economy showed signs of life again. Farms gradually returned to producing food, workshops reopened, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the continent might finally be heading back toward normal. That fragile recovery came to a sudden and devastating end in 1347. A deadly disease swept into Europe and unleashed a catastrophe so enormous that it would forever define the century. The Black Death most likely began somewhere in Asia before making its long journey westward, eventually reaching Europe through expanding trade routes. The Great Mortality. The plague finally reached Europe through the Genoese trading port of Kaffa on the Crimean coast. One of history's darkest stories comes from the siege of that city. While Mongol forces surrounded Kaffa, a mysterious disease spread through their own camp. Realizing they could no longer continue the siege, the Mongol commander reportedly decided to leave behind one final gift. Using catapults, his army hurled the bodies of plague victims over the city walls, creating one of the earliest recorded examples of biological warfare. When the Mongols finally withdrew, Genoese merchants wasted no time escaping by sea and sailing toward Constantinople. The problem was that they carried far more than merchandise. Hidden among them was the plague itself. From Constantinople, the disease followed the busiest trade routes into Europe, spreading with terrifying speed. Everywhere it arrived, it left destruction behind. Entire towns were emptied, families disappeared, and communities that had existed for generations simply vanished. The Black Death didn't slowly work its way across Europe. It swept over the continent with incredible speed, transforming medieval society in only a few short years. The disease traveled mainly with rats and the fleas that fed on them. Inside the fleas, the bacteria Yersinia pestis multiplied until the insects bit new hosts, passing the infection along. Once the plague entered a town, it usually burned through the population in less than a year. During that short time, it could kill as many as 1 out of every 3 people. Those suffering from the bubonic form of the plague developed the swollen, painful lumps known as buboes, which became the disease's most recognizable symptom. Septidemic plague was even more ruthless, often killing its victims so quickly that obvious symptoms barely had time to appear. The pneumonic form inspired perhaps the greatest fear of all. It began with a sudden fever, followed by a face that darkened in color, violent sneezing, relentless coughing, and coughing up blood. Death often arrived only a few days later. The first great wave of the Black Death finally faded in Scandinavia around 1351. Even then, Europe received no lasting relief. Fresh outbreaks returned in 1365 and continued appearing throughout the following decades. Eventually, for reasons historians and scientists still debate, the plague became less destructive and was gradually replaced by recurring epidemics of diseases such as typhoid, typhus, and cholera. When the plague finally loosened its grip, Europe had been changed forever. The psychological scars ran just as deep as the physical losses. People's attitudes toward life, death, religion, and authority shifted dramatically. Trust in the church weakened. Tensions between social classes grew stronger, and historians would later describe this period as the crisis of the late Middle Ages. The famine, the repeated outbreaks of disease, and the massive loss of population created the perfect conditions for widespread unrest. Major rebellions erupted across Europe, including the Jacquerie in France and the English Peasants' Revolt. At the same time, the 100 Years' War continued dragging on, adding even more suffering to an already exhausted continent. Those weren't the only conflicts either. Europe also endured the 28-year Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War in France, the 52-year Byzantine-Ottoman War, the 51-year Bulgarian-Ottoman War, and later, during the 15th century, the Wars of the Roses, which stretched on for more than 3 decades. Together, these wars claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. As if famine, plague, and endless warfare weren't enough, the Catholic Church fell into one of the greatest crises in its history. Between 1378 and 1417, the Western Schism split the Church itself. Rival papacies in Rome and Avignon both claimed to be the legitimate spiritual authority, and at certain points there were even multiple popes competing for power. Instead of providing stability during a time of chaos, the Church became another source of confusion and political conflict. By the end of the late Middle Ages, huge parts of Europe had been crushed beneath the combined weight of hunger, disease, war, rebellion, and political turmoil. Looking at the medieval period as a whole, it's hard to argue that there was a more miserable time to be alive than those final centuries. So that raises an interesting question. If you had the chance to travel back to the Middle Ages, which period would you avoid at all costs? Thanks so much for spending your time with me today. I really hope you enjoyed this episode of Medieval Madness. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed, because your support genuinely helps the channel continue to grow. If you'd like to support the channel even further and unlock bonus content, you can also join through Patreon or YouTube memberships. Members at the higher tiers even get their names featured at the end of each episode, just like the wonderful people you see on the screen right now. Thanks again for watching. I truly appreciate every one of you. Until then, take care, have a great week, and I'll see you next time.